And the cinema's best-known Dracula, Christopher Lee, is part of our welcoming committee on this new series of Behind the Headlines. I'm Linda Agren, and later in the programme we turn to a subject that is as much a matter of fantasy as Dracula, the perfect relationship. But we begin by asking what's behind a veritable hearseful of vampire books and movies on offer over the next few months. There's around a dozen new vampire movies, several books, and there's even a television vampire opera for Christmas. Well, it's nearly 100 years since Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, so why this sudden rush of bloodletting? Is the vampire story a metaphor for AIDS? Does the immortal Count Dracula reflect our angst about the end of the millennium? Or is it all just Hollywood hype because they haven't had a new idea since Serial Killers? Let's have a look at some of the 90s versions.
You know, Buffy, you're not like other girls.
Hi.
Huh.
Yes, I am. I didn't even break a nail.
Bet they don't get many miles to the pint out of that. Joining Christopher Lee are Anne Billson, a film critic who's just written her first novel, Suckers, a story about trendy young vampires in London's Docklands. Also, movie critic Kim Newman has just published a vampire novel, and Nik Fiend fronts a cult gothic band called Alien Sex Fiend, which appeals to a growing number of young nightclubbing Dracula devotees. First, let's get a reaction from the critics. Anne, why do you think everyone's suddenly gone bats about vampire stories?
I think it's probably because the vampire is the perfect symbol for our age. I think he's the James Bond for the 90s, if you like. And also I think he represents a lot of things that concern us these days. We're worried about AIDS, we're worried about exploitation. He fits in very, very nicely, I think.
Fits in nicely. Kim, would you go along with that?
I think certainly there isn't a current appeal to vampires. I think it's rather more cyclical than passing. We seem to get a vampire boom once every 10 years. There are kind of primal things about it that are always appealing. Certainly the fact that, unlike most monsters, vampires are quite well dressed and sort of stylish and charming sometimes, even when they're doing terrible things. Also, the basic act of vampirism serves as a metaphor for all kinds of things. You can talk about relationships in vampire terms, but also about politics, disease, you know, the way that countries work. I forget when the first time one saw, say, Margaret Thatcher caricatured as a vampire, but that image has always been part of most politicians.
We've touched on a lot of stuff here we'll come back to. Nik, you play to an audience of people who were born long after the first, or the most recent, most successful wave of Dracula movies. What do you think the appeal is?
I play to all ages, really, anything from, I think, 10 up to infinity, really, and I think everybody is still there's some people still interested in it, and there's a whole new generation of kids that obviously haven't experienced vampire movies or horror movies, and also, like Batman was redressed, I think it's interesting to keep redressing things to bring in more people into play.
Christopher, you were playing Dracula back in 1958. Was your response, aha, I am about to play a metaphor for my time?
No, I don't think so. It was just a coincidence for me that I was asked to play the character, and I did play it, and the impact of it was, well, very considerable, which for an actor, of course, is what you're aiming for. And for me, it's really this strange aura of immortality, perhaps, about the being for lack of a better phrase. The thought of immortality, of living forever, is something that doesn't bear thinking about, obviously. And that is why when I played the character, I always tried to put in an element of sadness, that he's doomed. As they said, undead. It wasn't from choice. So that's one aspect of it. Of course, to an actor, it's also a very challenging role and a very demanding part. It certainly isn't easy to play, because that's a very thin line between credibility and, of course, the opposite from the point of view of the audience. But, you know, it's for me, it's a part I played as an actor, which at a certain stage of my career was of enormous help to me. But I haven't done it for 21 years, so I'm a bit out of touch.
Did you know it was going to be a classic at the time? Did you know that Count Dracula was going to be with you forever?
No, no, I don't think any of us did. We were quite surprised, I think, at least I certainly was.
You made Count Dracula extremely attractive, very charming, very urbane. Do you think that all subsequent Draculas, I'd like to ask you all about that, have to break that mould?
Well, you asked me first.
Yes, indeed.
And that, again, was a coincidence. I read the book. It's as simple as that. I read the book. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people haven't done. And a lot of people who played it probably didn't read it. A lot of people who've seen the films have probably not read the book. But I read the book. I must be fair and say that I didn't receive very much direction. It was more arranging things than telling me what to do. It was a question of my own instincts, my own imagination, whatever inventive powers I had from reading the book. The character is erotic. The character is romantic. The character is heroic. He is all those things. He is unstoppable as far as the average man is concerned, and irresistible as far as the average woman is concerned. If he was urbane, well, he was a great aristocrat, a great leader. The ferocity is also there of the animal in that character. That is what I tried to put in instinctively, and it seems to have worked.
Would you, Anne, do you think that this is the Dracula mould? This is the image that we all think of? And I'd like to ask you too, Kim.
I think so, but in the last 15 or so years, there's been a big change, and these days you often find vampires who are almost sympathetic. We're not nearly as frightened of vampires now as we used to be, possibly because we've all lost our faith, or some of us have lost our faith. And if you watch Sesame Street, there's a vampire character on that. There's I think a breakfast cereal in America called Count Chocula. So Dracula, this sort of great big, horrible sort of bogeyman, is being sold to children as well. It's obviously something that sort of permeated every age group now.
Kim, the original Dracula was repulsive.
Oh, certainly. That's what I tried to do. In my book, Anno Dracula, I did have an attempt to reinvent the character that Stoker created. I wanted something that was consistent with what Stoker wrote, but was also something you haven't seen before. So I made him a sort of loathsome barbarian prince. But I was kind of interested in Dracula as a political figure rather than as a kind of romantic one. So it's about what would happen if he'd taken over Britain in the 1880s and married Queen Victoria and become sort of the successor to Prince Albert. But I just like the idea of someone who was completely disgusting, which is what Stoker does at the beginning of the book, and then kind of erodes away. When Christopher played it, there was still a sense of brutality and ancient evil there, which I think has been kind of eroded from vampires recently. Certainly in Anne Rice's books, we have rather pretty vampires.
He was a loathsome barbarian prince.
Nasty man.
It is about image that appeals to you, I should think, rather than the blood and the rest
Seems
of it.
to be, yes. As I got older, it seems to be that I've gone right back to that. I'm much more affected by pictures and feeling than I'm not a great reader. I would start reading a book and be 10 pages into it and want to be a vampire. I'm probably practicing to fly or do something like that. Or
Not advisable.
Yes,
it's not advisable. No, especially, no.
Were you
kids, no.
influenced by the films you saw?
Terrified because I moved to Norfolk when I was 12 years old, and lived in a place called Dereham, which had lots of old mysteries, and people used to tell you about all the horrible things, the headless coachman and things that used to go around the church at midnight. And I happened to see Christopher in one of the Dracula films at my friend's house. And then my friend said, oh, we're going to take a shortcut through the cemetery afterwards. And it just had this effect on me, the whole vampire thing, then with the cemetery and also Alice Cooper at an early age with doing black juju and all those sort of songs just had an effect on me which hasn't really gone away. And so now I'm actually living that out, I suppose, myself.
And the baddies do get to wear all the good gear, don't they?
Yeah. And
They always have
the
done.
women, like Christopher said, the women are sort of all after them, and the men want to beat them up or
And
hate 'em.
what is a 1990s Dracula? And is it possible that actually selling your soul for immortality is not such a bad idea these days?
I don't think I'd like to be immortal. In a perfect world, you'd learn a lot of languages and be able to recognise birds and trees and something. But in real life, you just spend all that extra time in front of the television with a cancellara.
Wouldn't have many friends either.
I'd give it a try.
But I think there's also something in our age which is we're very fascinated by evil. This might also be something to do with the lack of faith, in that Silence of the Lambs, Anthony Hopkins, who was a sort of cannibal, cannibal psychopath, was the hero of that in a way. We're much more fascinated by evil characters than we are by good ones. It's easier to define evil, and evil characters have all the best clothes, the best lines, and can pick up women more easily.
What is it about this, the AIDS metaphor you both sort of nodded and touched on, seem to be in agreement with? Kim, can you explain a bit about this?
Oh, well, it seems to me one of the most blatantly obvious, and actually I think rather tedious things, is to link vampirism with AIDS, or say that vampire movies are now having a resurgence because of AIDS. In fact, Bram Stoker uses a lot of disease metaphor anyway. It's quite probable that many of the original vampire folk myths are to do with the plague, particularly coming out of Eastern Europe, and the use of rats and all that kind of stuff. So it's always been a part of the story. I think there is a kind of daft, trendy aspect to that, which is my tip for being the most boring vampire cliche of the next 10 years. There will be vampire AIDS movies, and maybe we'll get past that and get into something else.
Maybe we'll all be dead by then.
Christopher, it must be really extraordinary to have this total other identity. Do you find, I was sort of wondering, what's it like going through passport control as you?
I've never had a problem with this. People seem to think that everybody recognises me only for having played that part. I'm happy to say that's not the case, because I played it maybe 6 or 7 times, and I've done 220 other movies. So fortunately, I'm not confined to playing of that character. I can only say that people from all generations, which he was talking about earlier, have seen these films, either when they came out originally, which would be my generation, older, and perhaps the next one, or they've seen them on video, or they've seen them on television. Now, I've had people approach me all over the world, in the streets, anywhere you please, and the young have been the least frightened, because they can see that, for me, what I was doing was really a fairy story. It was a morality play. They're not frightened. You can't fool them, because the character that I was representing in the playing of this Dracula did exist, as I think people know.
Someone phones you up tomorrow and says, Christopher Lee, there's $1 million, which is chicken feed nowadays, isn't it? $1 million, would you do it again?
I would be tempted to play the character again, as I say, after 21 years, but only on one condition, and not the money, although that would certainly be a condition, but the primary condition would be do the film exactly as Stoker wrote the book. Exactly. Every character, all his lines, well, not all, but...
Nick's face lit up.
Exactly. It's never been done.
Nick's face, I'm going to go round
done.
you all. Nick, your face lit up. Yes, you think it's a good idea?
Yes, I definitely think so. In the light of all the different movies that's coming out and books and everything, I think there's room for everything, and I think that's a good thing.
That's a yes one.
Yes, the definitive version, we'd like to see that.
Yes, it's never been done.
Kim?
I'm not sure about definitive versions. I think Dracula is like Hamlet or Sherlock Holmes. There should be a new one every 10, 15 years, which should be based in the original, but should bring in a contemporary or a different slant to the basic material. I think it's good enough to warrant that many interpretations.
Kim Newman, Christopher Lee, Anne Billson and Nik Fiend, thank you all very much.
Thank you.